Barbara Snyder from the Atlantic Council. I want to say that I reject also the South African comparison. It's just complete apples and oranges, and I think it's much more coordinated situation. The question is about Iran. Nobody's talked about the Iranian role. The U.S. government says that they're there and they're fomenting all sorts of problems. They're giving nasty advice to the Assad regime. What is the evidence that Iran is doing much, if anything, there? And are they at all a player in the solution, or are they going to be made irrelevant? Yes.
Okay, one question with that here with Jonathan.
U.S. European Command. Mine is really a follow-up question to what Barbara just asked, and that would be, we mentioned the connection with Turkey. She just mentioned the connection with Iran. In terms of some of the actors, Syria's had a long history with Hezbollah and others. What are the stakes for each of these actors as far as what could happen? We discussed a little bit the discussion that the Turks have. And what are the implications of them possibly acting to protect the stake that they have in the existing regime, or to influence change that would be advantageous to them?
Okay, I'll take a start with you.
Sure. The disadvantage, Barbara, is that you know much more about Iran than I do, so you're probably in a better position to answer that question. I have heard from a number of people whom I regard as reliable that there is an Iranian presence inside of Syria. The most recent story I heard is that the chief of police of Tehran was dispatched to Damascus to provide training in crowd control to his counterparts in the hope of shifting the strategies deployed by Syrian forces from shooting at unarmed civilians to tear gassing and beating unarmed civilians, which I think is probably a step forward in the scheme of things. But I'm not sure, as you can see from the levels of casualties in recent protests, that these lessons have been absorbed. With respect to whether Iran can actually contribute to a solution, I'd like to. I think it would take a bit more time for us to parse through the scenarios under which Iran might be induced to play some kind of a constructive role. I think one pathway might be that because of the scale of Iranian interests in the continuity of governance in Syria, that they might actually put some pressure on the Syrian regime to take more seriously this strategy that Ammar suggested of defining the terms of their own transition, of their own exit, or of moving in a much more committed and serious fashion towards some kind of engagement with the opposition. But then you have to ask yourself, if the outcome of those strategies is to transform the political system in Syria, is that in Iran's long-term interest? In terms of Hezbollah, I was in Beirut last week and talked about this with a number of people. And I think the overall conclusions were that Hezbollah is very nervous, that they are deeply concerned about the implications of disorder in Syria or the collapse of the Assad regime, and that one of the consequences, should that come about, would be for Hezbollah to move directly to assert its control over the Lebanese political system as a way to prevent any kind of preemptive move that might contain its power in Lebanon. I think there was very little sense that it was in Hezbollah's interest to be provocative in some kind of cross-border fashion with Israel. I talked with someone, a professor who had Palestinian students who participated in the planning of the demonstrations on the Al-Nakba anniversary. Those demonstrations had been planned for months in advance. I think the argument here that they were, sort of ginned up by Hezbollah and the regime to show that they could create instability on the border was widely seen by people with very direct knowledge of those events to be false. But nonetheless, I think what we saw, and we traveled a bit through the Dahyan in sort of the Hezbollah neighborhoods in Beirut, is a very, very tangible sense of uncertainty and concern about Syria.
Do you want to take the Turkey question?
Was there a Turkey question?
I think, about Iran again, I think we really need to take under consideration the fact that there are already security agreements and mutual defense pacts signed between Syria and Iran. So the idea that the Iranians are being involved in the situation and advising the Assad is not far-fetched at all. In fact, this is what allies are expected to do in this situation. And we've heard it from a variety of sources also in Syria that this kind of security cooperation is indeed taking place, and that crowd control and ways of dealing with the protesters, especially in the area of Damascus and Aleppo in particular, is that the Iranian parties have been playing a key role in this. So we should not really look at this as a surprising fact in itself. Now, the question really ahead of us, and the serious question, is that to which extent would the Iranians sort of be involved in the Syrian situation, and to what extent will they go to keep the Assads in power? Will they send Basij people? Will they send sort of troops and be directly involved in the situation? There have been allegations of this kind of, in fact, involvement, that such snipers were Iranians or trained in Iran or Hezbollah members, in fact, for a while, but we have really not seen any single proof of that. Every time we've heard the allegations, for instance, in Daraa, for instance, some people said, hey, we even captured some. I said, well, fine, send us videos,
Mm-hmm.
So the reality is, I think the fact that these rumors exist, the fact that you hear people in some protest movement in Daraa and elsewhere saying no Iran, no Hezbollah, is clearly an indication of the awareness of the street of the important alliance that exists between the three parties, the regime, Iran, and Hezbollah. But at the same time, we don't see evidence beyond advice role. And I really believe that the Iranians are not going to, personally, I don't believe the Iranians, despite the fact that this is an important alliance for them, would intervene directly in Syria. Israel is right there on the border. Interfering in direct manner is going to be perceived as a threat by Israel. It could, court a strike against nuclear targets in Iran or whatever, basically by Israel. You never really know how this is going to evolve. Also, Iran has a lot of good relationship with Turkey, with the Erdogan government, and I really don't think they want to necessarily risk having this kind of a cordial relationship with the Turkish government in order to save the Assads. I think also they realize that they can still maintain some element of influence within Syria, even post-Assad, if they really looked at it. I mean, they do have a lot of community, they do have a lot of influence, basically, inside Syria beyond the Assads, and they can still be part of the political scene, basically, in Syria. So I think, personally, I don't believe the Iranians will go the distance for the Assads if they perceive that the Assads are indeed on their way out. It's going to be a question of how they can sort of, perhaps they can begin engaging the opposition at some point too, and identify people that they can actually serve as the role of interlocutors of Iranian interests, basically a representative of Iranian interests in Iran, just like Hezbollah is doing perhaps, but hopefully without the armed. But no indications. No. There is absolutely no indications. I'm just saying this is a hypothetical, futuristic scenario. But I believe that the Iranians have that kind of a sophisticated political outlook, whether for good or bad, in terms of the way they project their power in the region, and they may not necessarily be willing to go the distance for the Assads. One last comment I'd like to make is that, very quickly,